At her son's will reading, her daughter-in-law leaned forward and said, "She doesn't deserve a penny." Margaret Ellis, retired banker and widow, didn't blink. Samantha smiled, certain the room was hers. By week's end, the will, the deed, and the accounts would all tip in Margaret's favor. She'd spent decades building the family's fortune. Now she was keeping every cent. And when Samantha learned who paid the lawyer, it would be far too late. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The law office smelled like old paper and salt water, like a place that remembered every promise ever broken. Evelyn Harper paused at the threshold, letting the door thud shut behind her. The old brick building had outlived wars and hurricanes. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows, catching dust in the air and the soft gleam of framed maritime maps. Somewhere outside, gulls heckled a fishing boat easing toward the marina. Inside, it was too quiet. Lydia sat at the conference table, a clean white blouse tucked into a pencil skirt the color of wet asphalt. Her chin tipped slightly toward the window as if the harbor had more to say than anyone in the room. She didn't look at Evelyn. The man seated beside her, square jaw, silk tie, and the smug stillness of a paid bulldog, adjusted his legal pad without a sound. He didn't look at Evelyn either. That was new. Once upon a time, even Lydia's lawyers had pretended to be polite. "Mrs. Harper." Michael Rowe's voice warmed the room by 10 degrees. He stood as she entered, tall and a little rumpled in that way that made his shoes shine more than his suit. He squeezed her hand just once, quick, solid, and the corner of his mouth shifted 0.5 millimeter in a gesture no one but her would have read. A nod. Breathe. Not yet. Evelyn sat at the far end, the chair giving a soft creak under her weight. She folded her hands and set them neatly on the table. Her ring, plain gold, a dozen tiny scratches, caught the same light the maps did. She could feel the eyes that weren't looking at her. She could feel Daniel's name in the walls. Michael cleared his throat. On the credenza, a small recorder blinked red. "We're here to read and execute the last will and testament of Daniel Harper," he said, professional cadence settling over his words like a linen cloth. "Present are Lydia Harper, widow of the deceased, accompanied by counsel. Mr. Grayson, is it?" "Grayson," the man confirmed with a curt nod, "and Mrs. Evelyn Harper, mother of the deceased." Another glance, quick as a heartbeat. Evelyn inclined her head without speaking. Outside, a horn bleated. Inside, paper slid across wood as Michael opened the file. He read. The legal language moved like slow water around corner pilings, land parcels enumerated, business interests described, personal effects named with care. Daniel's handwriting appeared here and there in the margins, a date, a correction, his block letters stubborn and familiar. Evelyn kept her eyes on the window, the harbor rippling like scales. Across from her, Lydia's foot scuffed once, a controlled little tap against the carpet. Her lipstick could cut glass. She didn't fidget, didn't wipe her palms. She just stared at a point in the middle distance and waited for the part where someone handed her a life. Michael turned a page. "There is a portion of the estate," he said, the tone almost conversational, "which is pending review, specifically itemizations connected to contested amendments filed within the last 6 months." The air changed, not a draft, something quieter the way a room holds its breath. Grayson's pen paused. Lydia's head tilted. For a second her eyes slid toward Evelyn's face and then away again, as if the glance itself cost her. "Contested," she repeated, voice flat. "Meaning what?" "Meaning those amendments are not yet validated by the court," Michael said evenly. "They may be admitted or they may not. The original will remains operative until that question is resolved." Lydia's mouth tightened. "Daniel wanted—" "We'll stay with the document," Michael said. Not unkindly, just firm. "As written," he continued, "the marina shares, the waterfront property, a trust with terms that were clear and familiar to Evelyn in the way a shoreline is familiar. You know where the rocks are without looking." Lydia's gaze sharpened, predatory. The lawyer's pen resumed its quiet scratching. Evelyn felt her pulse in her wrists, slow and steady. She'd learned that trick years ago. Count your heartbeat instead of the seconds. Breath in for 4, hold for 4, Out for 6. You can outlast any storm if you keep the boat pointed into the wind. The recorder's red eye blinked on, off, on. And the personal effects, Michael finished, to be distributed according to the list attached as Exhibit C. He laid the page flat with the side of his hand, knuckles pale. At this time, no property is to be conveyed pursuant to the contested amendments until the court's review is complete. The quiet popped. Lydia's laugh was short and bright, a champagne cork blown into a wall. "This is absurd." She turned her head then, finally, and looked straight at Evelyn like a person picks a spot on a target. "She doesn't deserve a penny." Grayson's chin lifted. It was the first thing he'd seemed to enjoy. Evelyn didn't flinch. Her face did what it always did in public, the pleasant neutrality of a woman who'd outlived gossip. She heard the chorus of the harbor, gulls, rope, the crank of a winch, and let it fill in the places where anger might have been. She had learned something else long before Lydia arrived in their lives. Rage was a fast sugar. It burned hot, then left you shaky. Better to store the energy in muscle and bone, let it unfurl when it counted. Michael set his pen down without looking at Lydia. "Mrs. Harper is a named beneficiary," he said, mild as weather. "The will speaks for itself." "She manipulated him," Lydia said. Her voice carried a nerve she couldn't hide. "He was confused these last months. Everyone saw it." "Everyone?" Evelyn's voice surprised her by coming out smooth. She turned her head slowly, taking in Lydia's immaculate cheekbones, the tiny smear of mascara at the corner that meant she'd pressed her eyes earlier in the car. "Or just the people who told you what you wanted to hear?" Grayson cut in. "We'll be challenging the so-called pending status. The amendments reflect Daniel Harper's true intentions. If you think we're going to sit while you fence off his estate with a technicality, you're mistaken." Michael's gaze flicked to Evelyn. There and gone, like a signal flame in fog. "Stay composed." He folded the will and placed his palm lightly on it, like a blessing. "We'll note your objection on the record," he said. "In the meantime, the estate will be managed according to the existing terms. A timetable for the review will be set by the clerk's office." Lydia leaned back, the chair whispering along the carpet. For the first time, Evelyn saw what fatigue looked like on her, how it lived in the angles around her mouth. "You think you can stall me?" "I think we can follow the law," Michael said. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang twice and stopped. The seaside map on the wall, 1829 survey of tidal flats, tilted the barest degree, as if the building itself had shifted to listen. "Then let's follow it," Grayson said, reaching for his brief. "Because we'll be filing for immediate relief." Michael's fingers tapped once against the folder, then stilled. "Of course." He looked finally to Evelyn, not smiling now. Just looking. The kind of look you give a diver before she goes under, the kind that says the water is cold but you've swum it before. Evelyn held his eyes for a breath, then two. Outside the window, a shrimp boat pushed out toward open water, its rigging swaying like ribs. Michael drew a second, thinner stack of papers toward him. The top page bore Daniel's name, the ink a dense, familiar black. He slid it to the center of the table, the recorder's red light catching the edge like a drop of blood. "There is one more item," he said, voice level, "and it needs to be addressed before anyone leaves this room." The moment Michael's words landed, Lydia shoved back her chair so hard the legs shrieked against the carpet. Her lawyer rose more slowly, gathering his papers with deliberate precision, but Lydia didn't wait for him. She cut a sharp path to the door, heels punching the wood floor, perfume trailing like gun smoke. Sophie, who had been quiet in the corner through the entire reading, straightened as her stepmother passed. Lydia didn't look at her. The door banged once and the echo seemed to hang in the high-ceilinged room a beat too long. Evelyn pushed herself to her feet, slower, her fingers brushing the tabletop as if she were smoothing the grain. Sophie stepped beside her, close enough their sleeves touched, and together they crossed the room toward Michael's office. He led them past the reception desk, past a row of framed nautical charts, into a smaller room lined with file cabinets. Once they were inside, he shut the door, quietly, but with the finality of a lock clicking home. The sound cut the outside world in two. Without a word, he reached for the lower drawer of his desk and drew out a thick envelope, cream-colored and heavy enough to bow in his hand. He set it on the polished wood between them, then rested his palm on top. "For your eyes only," he said, low enough that even the walls might miss it. Evelyn pulled the envelope toward her, the paper warm from his hand. She unfolded the clasp, sliding out a neat stack of documents bound with a metal clip. The smell of ink and old folders rose up, the scent of things that had been waiting. On top, property deeds, each stamped with the tidy block letters of the Charleston County Recorder. Marinas, parcels along the waterfront, a strip of commercial buildings near the pier. Her name, Evelyn M. Harper, appeared again and again in signatures firm and unshaken. Lydia's name was nowhere. Sophie leaned in, her dark hair falling forward. "These are yours?" she asked, voice tight with something between awe and relief. "They've been mine for years," Evelyn said softly. Her fingers paused over one deed for the East Marina, the one Daniel had spent summers painting in fresh coats of white. Michael stepped around the desk, leaning against the edge so his shadow fell across the papers. "I've been managing these for you since before Daniel married Lydia. All titles are clear, no liens, no shared ownership. And the amendments Lydia keeps leaning on?" His gaze met hers, steady as the tide. "Never executed properly. They're paper, nothing more." Evelyn nodded once, the motion small but sharp. She kept her eyes on the deeds, as if their black and white certainty could anchor her. "So she can shout all she wants, but she can't touch these." "She can try to make noise," Michael said. "But noise won't change the record books." Sophie's shoulders eased, but her eyes stayed restless. Evelyn caught the movement, how quickly the girl's relief tangled with suspicion. She remembered that look from her own youth, the moment you learn security is always temporary. Evelyn slid the papers back into the envelope, pressing the clasp until it clicked. "We keep this quiet," she said, her voice dropping into that same private register Michael had used. "Until the right moment." Michael inclined his head. "When she overreaches, she'll show her hand. That's when we move." Sophie looked from one to the other. "And if she doesn't wait?" Evelyn slipped the envelope into her leather bag, the weight of it pulling on her shoulder like a promise. "She will. Lydia can't help herself." The three of them stood there a moment, the muffled hum of traffic outside, and the faint, briny draft from a cracked window, the only sounds. Michael moved back behind his desk, flipping open a different file. His expression sharpened. No longer the lawyer smoothing tempers, but the strategist laying out a map before a storm. "There's something else," he said, tapping the folder's corner. "If you're ready to see just how deep this goes." Michael didn't wait for Evelyn to answer his last question. He reached into the credenza behind his desk and pulled out a second folder. Dark green, its clasp sealed with a narrow strip of red tape. The kind of tape you only see on things that aren't supposed to be opened lightly. He set it between them, his hand still resting on the cover for a moment as if to weigh it down. "This," he said, "never left my possession until today." Evelyn slid into the chair opposite him, the envelope of property deeds still heavy in her bag. Sophie, sensing the shift, stayed standing just off her grandmother's shoulder. Michael broke the seal. Inside, the papers were clean, crisp, and damning. Bank statements, company credit card reports, ledger excerpts. Evelyn's eyes moved down the first page. An account under the name Harper Marine Services, LLC, the same company Daniel had built from a single leased slip to a fleet of 10 boats. Line after line, the numbers told their own quiet story. Luxury hotel bills in Miami and Chicago, jewelry purchases from a boutique in Savannah, a wire transfer to an exclusive car dealership in Charlotte. And every one of them charged to the business. Her jaw tightened as she flipped to the next set. There were no gaps, no plausible mistakes to hide behind. Lydia hadn't even tried to disguise the withdrawals. "She didn't think anyone would be looking," Michael said. He stayed seated this time, his voice steady, though his fingers tapped once on the desk before stilling again. "Daniel's accountant sent me copies when the irregularities started last year. He asked me to keep them until—" Sophie leaned forward, reading over Evelyn's arm. Until what? Evelyn didn't look at her yet. She was still staring at a line for Ocean Pearl Spa Resort, 5 nights, paid in full. Daniel had hated spa resorts. Her voice came low. He suspected. That's why he called me before. She stopped. Her breath had caught, and she didn't want the rest of that sentence in the air, not yet. Sophie's gaze sharpened. Before what? Evelyn closed the folder gently, her palm flat on the cover. Not now, Sophie. Michael gave the faintest nod, as if to agree that some truths could wait. This file isn't for court yet. If she makes a move, tries to drain accounts, sell assets, smear you in the press, this will stop her cold, but using it too soon gives her room to spin it. Evelyn weighed that. The folder felt heavier than the paper inside, like the kind of weight you carry in your chest until the moment comes to drop it. We hold it, she said, until she forces my hand. Michael leaned back, relief barely visible in the slack of his shoulders. Exactly. Sophie crossed her arms. And if something happens to you? The room went still. Evelyn's eyes found hers, steady and unblinking. Then you open this. You read every word, and you decide how to use it. Michael slid the folder into a flat archival box and pushed it across the desk toward Evelyn. Keep it somewhere no one else can touch it. Evelyn took it, tucking it beside the deed envelope in her bag. The leather strained slightly under the combined weight. Outside, the distant horn of a container ship rumbled through the walls. Sophie shifted, as if the sound unsettled her. Evelyn reached over and squeezed her wrist. Not a comfort, exactly, but a signal. I'm still here. Michael's phone buzzed on the desk. He glanced at the screen, and whatever name or number appeared there drained the faint warmth from his face. He silenced it without answering. Looks like she's already making her next move, he said. The bank's double doors sighed shut behind Evelyn, muting the hum of late-morning traffic. The lobby smelled faintly of polished brass and the sharp citrus cleaner they used on the marble floors. Sophie followed close, her sneakers squeaking once before she caught herself. Through the wide front windows, Evelyn caught a flash of Lydia's white SUV easing into the street. Even at a distance, she recognized the decisive way Lydia turned the wheel. Always just a little too sharply, as if life should move aside for her. The branch manager, a tidy man in a navy suit, was already walking toward them. Mrs. Harper, he said, lowering his voice as soon as they shook hands. You just missed your daughter-in-law. Evelyn tilted her head, letting him choose his next words carefully. He glanced toward the tellers, then gestured toward a side office with frosted glass. Inside, he shut the door, smoothing his tie before speaking. She attempted to withdraw the balance from a joint account under your name and your late son's. Sophie's brows shot up. Joint account? Evelyn kept her expression neutral, her bag still hooked over her arm. Go on. She presented herself as an authorized party, the manager continued, but the account was closed earlier this year. Our records reflect... Evelyn had already unzipped her bag. She drew out a thin folder, flipping it open to the stamped closure notice Michael had filed in April. The bank's own seal was clear in the corner. She slid it across the desk. You mean this record? The manager's shoulders eased, as if the paper itself gave him permission to breathe. Exactly that, Mrs. Harper. I simply thought you'd want to know she tried. Evelyn took the folder back, tucking it into her bag without looking at Sophie. I do, she said, and I appreciate you telling me. When they stepped back into the lobby, Sophie waited until they were outside before speaking. Is this the start of war? They walked toward the car, gulls wheeling overhead in slow, tilted circles. Evelyn unlocked the driver's side but didn't get in right away. She looked at Sophie, the girl's face still open enough to show both worry and anticipation. It's the middle, Evelyn said. She let the words settle between them, like the pause before a chess piece is moved. She just doesn't know it. They slid into the car, the smell of salt air clinging to their clothes. Evelyn started the engine, the old sedan's hum steady and sure. Halfway back to the marina, her phone buzzed in the cup holder. Michael's name lit the screen. She tapped the speaker button. She moved fast, he said without preamble. Grayson just filed for an emergency hearing. They want the amendments enforced immediately. Sophie turned toward the window, but Evelyn could see her reflection in the glass, her jaw set, her fingers drumming against her knee. "When?" Evelyn asked. "2 days," Michael said. "They're betting you won't be ready." Evelyn merged onto the narrow road that ran along the water, the sunlight flickering between live oak branches. "Then we'll make sure they regret the bet." Michael didn't laugh, but there was the sound of a pen clicking once, as if something had just been decided on his end, too. "Check your front porch when you get home," he said. "I sent over something you might want to see before we go in." The line clicked dead, leaving the low rush of the tide against the seawall to fill the silence. Evelyn kept her eyes on the road, but Sophie was still watching her reflection in the glass. The girl's voice was quiet when it came. "What happens if they win?" Evelyn didn't answer right away. She let the question sit, the way you let a hook sink before reeling in. Only when the wind rattled the loose flagpole outside the diner did she speak. "They won't." The courthouse smelled faintly of varnished wood and the paper tang of old files. Evelyn sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded loosely in her lap, the morning light from the high windows settling on her like a spotlight she didn't need. Lydia was already performing. She leaned toward the judge, chin high, eyes glassy with rehearsed outrage. "She manipulated Daniel in his final months," she said, her voice trembling just enough to seem unpracticed. "He was confused, grieving his father, and she coerced him into reverting the will. This isn't about money. It's about honoring his wishes." Michael didn't even look at her. He rose from his chair with a smooth, deliberate pace, the unaltered will in his left hand, the court's copy of the contested amendments in his right. "Your Honor," he said, voice low but carrying, "the amendments in question were drafted without the necessary witnessing, notarization, or filing. They hold no legal weight. The original will, executed 5 years ago, remains in full effect." He laid the documents on the judge's bench as if he were placing cards face up on a table where everyone else was bluffing. Lydia's attorney, Grayson, cleared his throat. "The amendments reflect Mr. Harper's verbal instructions." Michael cut him off with a single raised finger toward the judge. "Intent is not execution. The law is not an act of faith." Evelyn sat still. Not a blink, not a twitch. She let Michael carry the tide, dismantling each of Grayson's points with citations, dates, and procedural deficiencies so neat they almost sounded polite. Almost. The judge, a man with silver hair and a lined forehead that looked carved by years of weighing lies, paged through the files. When he looked up, it was at Lydia. "Mrs. Harper," he said evenly, "you will produce your personal and business financial records for the past 24 months. The court will review them for relevance to these proceedings." Lydia's smile was brittle enough to crack porcelain. "Those records are private." The gavel came down once. By Friday. The hearing adjourned. The shuffle of papers and the groan of benches filled the room, but Evelyn didn't move until Lydia swept past her, the smell of expensive perfume cutting through the dust. At the top of the courthouse steps, Lydia turned, her voice low enough for only Evelyn to hear. "You're not done with me." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "You were done," she said, "the moment you underestimated me." For a second, something flickered in Lydia's expression, confusion, maybe even fear, but it was gone before the next camera flash popped. Michael joined Evelyn on the steps, a slim file under his arm. "Good day in there," he murmured. "Good enough," she said, but his mouth didn't match his words. They stepped off the curb toward his car, Sophie trailing them with quiet eyes. Halfway across the street, Michael angled the file toward her bag. "This is from a friend at the planning board," he said. "You need to see it before we celebrate anything." Evelyn slid into the passenger seat and opened the file. Inside were photocopies of property listings, Daniel's old business holdings, warehouses, dockside lots, an office building he'd kept long after moving operations elsewhere. Each page had the same notation in the top right corner, "Pending sale." Evelyn's fingers stilled. These were frozen. "They're supposed to be," Michael said, "but Lydia's moving to offload them before the court can secure them as part of the estate. Quiet listings, cash-only buyers. She's doing it through a third-party broker to avoid the paper trail." Sophie leaned forward from the back seat. Can she even do that? Michael's eyes stayed on the road. Not legally. But by the time the system catches her… Evelyn closed the file, her reflection in the window lined with resolve. Then we catch her first. Michael parked half a block from the planning board office, letting the engine tick as it cooled. She's trying to move everything fast, he said, tapping the file in Evelyn's lap. Cash buyers, private contracts, nothing going through the usual real estate channels. By the time a judge freezes the properties, she could have them stripped and flipped twice over. Evelyn opened the file again, the photocopied listings flapping in the cross breeze from her cracked window. She's rushing. That's good. Rushing people make mistakes. Inside, the planning board's building felt like it had been built entirely out of old policy binders and the faint scent of burnt coffee. The director, a round-shouldered man Evelyn had known since he was a teenager bussing tables at Helen's Diner, shook her hand with a look that was half professional, half conspiratorial. "Mrs. Harper," he said, "your name's still on the right of first refusal agreements Daniel signed when he bought these. If the properties go on the market, even under a shell broker, you have the option to match the offer." Sophie, seated beside her in the narrow chairs, sat forward. "So we can just buy them back?" Evelyn kept her gaze on the director. "We could," she said, "if that were the play I wanted." Then she glanced at Sophie. "But it isn't." When they stepped outside again, the late afternoon air smelled of the tide turning. Sophie's voice was sharper now. "I can help, you know. I can look up buyers, track names online." Evelyn stopped at the bottom step, looking her granddaughter in the eye. "Not in this part of the game. Direct conflict isn't for you." Sophie's jaw worked, but she nodded. She didn't have to like the rule to follow it. The next stop was Helen's Diner, the scent of frying onions curling through the air before they even opened the door. The lunch crowd had thinned to a few locals with coffee mugs, and Helen herself was wiping down the counter. She took one look at Evelyn's face and waved them toward the back. The back room was little more than a storage nook with a sticky table and mismatched chairs, but Helen set out fresh coffee like it was a war council. "You need space to spread out," she said. "And maybe pie. Pie helps planning." Michael arrived 10 minutes later with a stack of blank legal forms and a laptop. The four of them bent over the table, maps of the Marina District and property records fanned out like a card game no one wanted to lose. By nightfall, Evelyn had signed the paperwork for injunctions on each property Lydia was trying to sell. Quiet filings stamped by the courthouse clerk before closing. The kind of move that didn't make a sound until the other player found the door locked. Michael gathered the signed pages into a single, neat stack. His smile was thin but real. "She'll realize you've boxed her in when the papers hit her broker's desk." Evelyn leaned back, her fingers curling around the mug Helen had topped off without asking. The coffee was strong enough to stand a spoon in, and for the first time all day, she let herself take a long sip. From the front of the diner, the bell over the door jingled. Twice. Quick. Helen's eyes flicked toward the sound, then back to Evelyn. "You might want to hear this," Helen said, her voice low. "That was one of Lydia's new friends. He's telling the counter she's got an even bigger deal lined up." The next morning, the television in Helen's Diner was tuned to the local news. Evelyn had been halfway through a plate of eggs when the anchor's voice cut in. Up next, an exclusive interview with Lydia Harper, widow of the late Daniel Harper, speaking out about the contested estate. Helen didn't even ask. She reached for the remote and turned the volume up. Lydia appeared on screen, seated in a tastefully staged living room, hands folded in her lap like a Sunday school teacher. "Daniel wanted his legacy to go to someone who understood him," she said, the edges of her smile trembling just enough to look sincere. "Unfortunately, his mother, she's never respected his wishes. It's not about the money, it's about honoring Daniel's heart." Beneath the chyron, Evelyn's name was printed in bold, followed by "accused of manipulating son's will." Helen muttered something that sounded like it should have been censored. Sophie, sitting beside Evelyn in the booth, looked ready to throw her juice glass. Evelyn just reached for her phone. Michael answered on the first ring. "Already saw it," he said. "And before you ask, yes, the injunction's active. The properties are untouchable." Evelyn's gaze stayed on the screen as Lydia's tone turned plaintive. "I've been forced into this legal mess when all I want is to grieve my husband." "Developer's attorney?" Evelyn asked. "Gone," Michael said. "Withdrew interest as soon as he saw our filings. Lydia's options just narrowed." After she hung up, Sophie was still fuming. "She's lying right to their faces, and they're eating it up." Evelyn's fork moved slowly, deliberately, cutting through a piece of toast. "Then we keep our own record." That afternoon, Sophie sat cross-legged on the living room floor with scissors, tape, and a stack of newspapers. Every article about the case, printouts, clippings, screenshots, went into a large black scrapbook. She labeled the cover in thick marker, "Receipt Book." "Because receipts never lie," she explained, holding it up. Evelyn gave the smallest approving nod. By evening, the air in the marina felt heavy with a storm that wasn't weather. Helen stopped by with a foil-covered plate and a look that carried more weight than dinner. "She's going to get personal now," Helen warned, lowering herself into the armchair across from Evelyn. "She tried playing the grieving widow on TV. Next, she'll go for blood." Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "Her blood or mine?" "Yours," Helen said flatly. "She'll try to make you the story." The prediction didn't take long to bear out. That night, Sophie burst into the den with her phone. "She posted about you." On the screen, Lydia's smiling face sat beside a block of text. "It's hard watching someone you once respected lose touch with reality. I just hope the court sees through her confusion before it's too late." Beneath it, a thread of comments bloomed, some sympathetic, some skeptical, some cruel. Helen's words hung in the air like the scent of salt before a hurricane. Evelyn took the phone, reading the post twice without a change in expression. "Let her talk," Evelyn said, setting it face down on the coffee table. Sophie opened her mouth to protest, but Helen shook her head. "She's baiting you, honey, and the thing about bait is you only take it if you want to get caught," Evelyn finished. Outside, the wind shifted, rattling the dock lines against the pilings. Somewhere in the distance, a boat horn sounded, low, long, and warning. It began as a whisper, the kind that slips into the cracks of a town like salt air through a warped window frame. At first, Evelyn only heard about it secondhand, a comment Helen mentioned in passing from a customer who wasn't sure if it was true, followed by a text Sophie received from a classmate asking if her grandmother had really stolen from her own husband's company. By mid-morning, the whisper had turned into something sharper. On one of the local online forums, buried among posts about yard sales and lost pets, an anonymous account had posted a grainy photograph of Evelyn from nearly 20 years ago. She was younger then, hair darker, shoulders set with the quiet determination she had worn during those years after her husband's death. The caption above the photo screamed in all caps, "Did she cheat her late husband's partners out of their share?" The story was thin, barely more than a few paragraphs, but it carried just enough detail to feel plausible to anyone who didn't know the history. It claimed that after her husband passed, Evelyn had manipulated the settlement of his business affairs to favor herself, leaving his two longtime partners with pennies on the dollar. There was no mention of the legal agreements those men had signed willingly, no acknowledgement that Evelyn had paid them above market value for their shares, or that she had carried the company through a recession that would have bankrupted them all. By lunchtime, the story had jumped from the forum to Facebook groups, text threads, and private messages. In a town like theirs, it didn't take long for the air to change. When Evelyn walked into Helen's diner that afternoon, she could feel it immediately. The subtle pause in conversation at two different tables, the polite but clipped greetings from people she had known for decades. They didn't look at her quite the same way, and that, she knew, was exactly what Lydia had intended. Sophie was already in a booth near the back, a half-empty glass of iced tea in front of her and her phone clutched in one hand. "They're saying you mismanaged Grandpa's estate," she said the moment Evelyn sat down. "That you froze out his partners and pocketed the profits. People are acting like it's some long-buried scandal." Evelyn reached for the coffee Helen had placed in front of her without being asked, stirring in cream with slow, unhurried motions. "I know what they're saying," she replied. Helen appeared a moment later, sliding a slice of pie onto the table. She leaned one hand on the back of the booth, her voice low but firm. "It's complete garbage. I remember those days. You did right by those men, more than right. Anyone who was here knows the truth." Evelyn lifted her eyes from the coffee to meet Helen's gaze. "The people talking now weren't here back then," she said quietly. "They don't know the truth. They only know the version someone's feeding them." Michael arrived a short while later, his jacket draped over one arm and a stack of papers tucked under the other. He slid into the booth beside Helen, glancing briefly toward the other diners before speaking. "Legally, it's irrelevant. The statute of limitations ran out on any possible dispute years ago, but reputationally—" He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Sophie, still holding her phone, finished it for him. "It makes the will case look like part of a pattern." Michael nodded once. "It's designed to color the judge's perception, to make him think you've been pulling strings for decades." Evelyn set her spoon neatly beside her cup. "And if I respond, I make it real. I breathe life into it." Sophie's brow furrowed, her frustration plain. "But silence looks like guilt." Evelyn met her gaze without flinching. "It looks like strategy. If I engage, she wins twice, once for planting the lie and again for forcing me to dance around it." Helen crossed her arms. "You're banking on people remembering who you are, not what they read on a screen." "I'm banking," Evelyn said, "on her overplaying her hand. When she does, I want the fall to be hers alone." They spent the rest of the afternoon discussing logistics, court dates, how to track Lydia's movements in the property market, but the weight of the rumor lingered around them like humidity before a storm. When they left the diner, Evelyn noticed the way heads turned as they passed. The looks weren't openly hostile, but they weren't warm either. Back at the house, Sophie retreated to her room almost immediately. Through the wall, Evelyn could hear the soft, steady tap of keys, her granddaughter documenting the new wave of articles and comments for her growing receipt book. Evelyn, meanwhile, stepped out onto the back deck. The marina lay in quiet silhouette against the late-day sky, the air heavy with the scent of brine and damp wood. In the distance, the faint clang of a buoy bell carried across the water, slow and rhythmic, a sound she had always found steadying. Her phone buzzed in her hand. The screen showed a blocked number. She hesitated only briefly before answering. The voice on the other end was a woman's, low, urgent, and unfamiliar. "Mrs. Harper, you don't know me, but I know who fed that story, and if I'm right, this isn't just about the estate." Before Evelyn could ask a single question, the line went dead. The morning of the hearing was gray and windless, the kind of weather that made the courthouse dome look heavier than it was. Evelyn walked up the stone steps with her leather bag resting against her hip, the weight of the archival box inside pressing against her palm through the worn strap. She had not opened the box since Michael had given it to her. She had not needed to. Michael was waiting at the top, his overcoat buttoned against a chill that wasn't really there. "Ready?" he asked. Evelyn's answer was a small, deliberate nod. Inside, the courtroom smelled faintly of paper, polish, and nerves. Lydia was already seated at the defense table, her hair swept up, her lipstick precise, the posture of a woman performing dignity for an audience. Grayson sat beside her, flipping through a legal pad as if he were rehearsing lines. When the judge entered, the shuffle of movement was followed by the usual formalities. Michael rose first. "Your Honor," he began, "at this time, my client wishes to submit new evidence relevant to the court's understanding of the estate's current disputes." Evelyn stood with him, setting the archival box gently on the table before lifting it into her arms and carrying it to the clerk. The seal on the folder inside was still unbroken. She could feel the faint ridges of the red tape under her fingertips as she handed it over. The judge adjusted his glasses as the clerk opened the file and began distributing copies. Page after page was passed forward, bank statements, company ledgers, receipts for purchases that had nothing to do with the business Daniel had built. There were hotel bills from resorts in cities Daniel had never visited, designer clothing bought in bursts, wire transfers to accounts with no apparent connection to the company. The silence in the room shifted, deepened. Lydia's head tilted, her lips pressing together in a line that was neither smile nor frown. Michael spoke again, his tone measured. These records show systematic diversion of business funds from Harper Marine Services to pay for personal expenses unrelated to the company. The amounts are significant. The timeline coincides with the period during which my client's daughter-in-law has been asserting control over these accounts. Grayson cleared his throat and leaned forward. Your Honor, we object to the introduction of this material without adequate time for review. We believe these documents are incomplete and— Objection overruled, the judge said, his voice cutting clean through the room. The court finds this information relevant. We will order an immediate independent audit of all accounts in Mrs. Lydia Harper's name, as well as any business accounts she has had access to during the past 3 years. Grayson tried again, his voice a touch sharper now. At least allow us a week to— Denied, the judge interrupted, his tone firm enough to stop further argument. The audit begins immediately. Failure to comply will be considered contempt of court. From her seat at the plaintiff's table, Sophie watched the change come over Lydia's face. It was subtle at first, a tightness around the eyes, a slight flush beneath the carefully applied makeup. But then her composure faltered entirely, the corners of her mouth pulling down as she glanced toward Grayson, searching for an answer he didn't have. Evelyn leaned slightly toward Michael, her lips barely moving. That's check. Michael's eyes stayed on the judge. Not yet, he murmured back. But almost. The rest of the hearing moved quickly, the way things often did once the momentum shifted. The judge issued instructions to the clerk, Michael submitted the original sealed file into evidence, and the date for the next review was set. As they were gathering their papers, a uniformed deputy approached the bench and handed the judge a folded slip of paper. He read it, his brow furrowing slightly before he set it aside. Counsel, remain available, he said. This matter may develop further. Outside, the air was damp and smelled faintly of the river. Lydia and Grayson left ahead of them, moving quickly down the steps without looking back. Sophie waited until they were out of earshot before speaking. She looked scared. Michael glanced at Evelyn. She should be. An independent audit means every transaction gets examined, and if the numbers say what I think they will— He didn't finish the sentence, but the meaning was clear. Evelyn stood still for a moment at the bottom of the courthouse steps, feeling the shift in the tide, not just in the case, but in the undercurrent that had been running between her and Lydia for years. Michael's phone buzzed. He read the message, then looked up at her with a quiet, measured expression. The auditor flagged something already, not just misuse of funds, possible fraud. They're looping in the district attorney. The corners of Evelyn's mouth curved, not into a smile, but into something colder, steadier. The game had just changed. The dawn tide was pulling out when Evelyn stepped onto the weathered planks of the East Marina, the woods still damp from the night's mist. The air held the briny tang of low water, mingled with the faint diesel scent of the trawlers prepping to head out. Gulls wheeled above in slow, lazy arcs, their cries carrying across the glassy water. She paused near the first row of slips, letting the rhythm of the place sink into her, halyards clinking against aluminum masts, ropes creaking against cleats, the slap of small waves under the dock. This was the soundscape she had known longer than her own quiet house, and for a moment it softened the sharp edges of the courthouse. A voice called out from the deck of a shrimp boat, roughened by years of salt air. "Mornin', Mrs. Harper." It was Tom, who had been docking here since Daniel was still in high school. "Morning, Tom," she replied, raising a hand in greeting. Another fisherman gave her a nod as he loaded bait barrels. A couple walking their dog stopped to ask after her health, their tone easy, unhurried. Here, at least, no one looked at her with the wary glances she had been collecting in town these past weeks. She walked toward the end of the pier, past the bench Daniel had insisted they install when Sophie was 6. She could still see him sitting there with her, a bright red kid-sized fishing rod between Sophie's knees, his larger hands guiding hers. The image came back to her in quiet fragments. Sophie's hair wind-blown into her face, Daniel showing her how to bait a hook without flinching, her squeal when she felt the first tug on the line. "You're in your head again," Helen's voice said from behind her. She turned to see her oldest friend approaching, a takeaway coffee in each hand. Helen passed one over and leaned on the rail beside her. "The hearing's in a few days. You ready?" Evelyn took a sip, the coffee strong enough to warm her all the way down. "More ready than she is." Helen gave her a sidelong look. Don't get comfortable. She's not finished yet, and you know it. Evelyn didn't answer right away. Instead, she set her coffee on the rail, unzipped her leather satchel, and pulled out a thin folder. Inside was the paperwork Michael had drawn up, documents transferring her Marina shares directly to Sophie, sealing them in her name so completely that no one, not even Evelyn herself, could reverse it without Sophie's consent. "I've been holding on to these," she said, sliding them toward Helen. "I'm filing today." Helen's eyes softened. "You're really going to do it?" "She's earned it," Evelyn replied, "and it'll keep this place safe, no matter what happens in that courtroom." They walked together back toward the small Marina office, the building's white paint just starting to pick up the gold of early sun. Evelyn stepped inside, greeted the clerk, and signed the last of the forms. Each pen stroke felt like an anchor line thrown overboard, securing something she refused to see drift away. Her phone rang before she had even capped the pen. Michael's name lit the screen. "Go ahead," she said. His voice carried a note she hadn't heard from him in weeks, something close to satisfaction. Her bail request was just denied. She's not walking out before the next hearing. Helen, catching the tone of the call, raised her brows in silent question. Evelyn allowed herself a small exhale. "Good," she said simply. Sophie arrived just as Evelyn was locking the office door. She was out of breath, her backpack slung over one shoulder. "I saw your car," she said, then glanced between the two women. "What's going on?" Evelyn didn't hide the news. "The Marina's yours now, signed and sealed." Sophie's mouth fell open, then curved into something between a smile and a gasp. "Does this mean it's over?" Evelyn looked past her, out toward the water where a trawler was easing out of the harbor, its wake cutting a long path toward the horizon. "No," she said, her voice steady. "It means we've just taken away the one thing she can't ever touch." The sound of a distant siren drifted across the water, faint but insistent, as if to remind them the fight wasn't done. The courtroom felt emptier than Evelyn had ever seen it. The benches, usually crowded with curious locals and quiet reporters, had only a thin scattering of people. The hum of whispered speculation was absent. Even the air seemed still, as though the building itself sensed there would be no performance today. Lydia sat at the defense table, alone. The chair beside her, where Grayson had sat through every hearing so far, was empty. The clerk had explained it in a clipped tone before the session began. Conflict of interest, no further details given. Whatever the reason, it had left Lydia without her usual shield of legal polish. She was dressed in a muted gray suit, her hair as immaculate as ever, but there was a hollowness in the set of her shoulders. Her eyes kept darting to the double doors at the back of the room, as if half expecting someone to sweep in and save her. The judge entered, his robe shifting in the morning light from the high windows. He took his seat and looked over the file in front of him. His voice was even, unhurried, but there was no softness in it. "Mrs. Lydia Harper," he began, "in light of the independent audit and the findings submitted to this court, your claims to the contested portions of the Harper estate are hereby dismissed in their entirety." The sound that followed was not applause, not outrage, just a quiet shift of bodies in their seats, a communal exhale. Lydia's hands tightened into fists on the table, her knuckles pale against the dark wood. Evelyn remained still at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She didn't allow herself the smallest flicker of satisfaction. She had learned long ago that triumph was safest when kept behind closed doors. The judge continued with formalities, deadlines for final filings, dates for the next procedural steps, but Evelyn barely registered them. Her focus was on the steady sound of the gavel as it came down once, final, and absolute. When the clerk announced the session adjourned, Evelyn rose without looking in Lydia's direction. She gathered her bag, adjusted the strap on her shoulder, and began the walk down the center aisle toward the doors. Sophie was waiting in the front row. She stepped into the aisle and fell in beside her grandmother, her presence quiet but sure. Just before they reached the hallway, Sophie's fingers slipped into Evelyn's, giving a small, deliberate squeeze. Evelyn didn't look at her, but she returned the pressure. The hallway outside was already gathering heat from the day, the air carrying the faint scent of dust and floor polish. Reporters had been waiting, they always did, and the moment Evelyn appeared, their questions came like pebbles against glass. "Mrs. Harper, do you have a statement? Do you believe justice was served today? Do you think Mrs. Lydia Harper will face criminal charges?" Before Evelyn could answer or ignore them, Michael stepped forward, his arm subtly guiding her path. "No comments at this time," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. His body formed a barrier between her and the microphones, his pace steady enough that the reporters had to walk backward to keep up. They reached the front steps. The sunlight was blinding for a moment, a sharp contrast to the dim formality inside. Helen was waiting at the bottom, her posture loose, a paper coffee cup in each hand. "Hot, the way you like it," she said, pressing one into Evelyn's palm. The steam curled up into the warm air. Evelyn accepted it with a nod. "Thank you." Helen glanced past her, toward the courthouse doors where Lydia still hadn't emerged. "She's not going to take this quietly." Evelyn took a slow sip, the heat of the coffee grounding her. She won't have much choice. A siren wailed faintly somewhere across town, distant but growing louder. Michael glanced toward the sound, then at Evelyn. That might not be for nothing. The letter arrived 2 mornings after the courthouse decision, slipped under Evelyn's front door with the rest of the mail. There was no return address, but the institutional envelope and the faint chemical smell of processed paper told her exactly where it had come from. She carried it into the kitchen without opening it, setting it beside the kettle while she measured coffee grounds into the filter. Steam began to rise, curling lazily toward the ceiling, but the letter remained untouched until the mug in her hand was full. Only then did she take her seat at the table, sliding a finger under the glued edge. The paper inside was thin, the handwriting uneven but familiar. Each loop and slash of Lydia's penmanship was the same as it had been on birthday cards and thank-you notes in better years. "Evelyn," it began, "I know you've heard things about me, some true, some not, and I need you to understand that none of this was my idea. I was misled, manipulated by people I trusted. I made mistakes, yes, but I never meant to hurt Daniel, you, or Sophie. The truth is, I'm in trouble I can't get out of alone. If you could see your way to helping me with legal expenses, I know I can make things right. Please, for Daniel's memory, don't turn your back on me." There was more. Pages of it, switching between flattery and blame, plea and justification. She read it once, slowly, her eyes tracking every line. Then she read it again, not because she doubted her memory, but because she wanted to feel each shift in tone, each careful manipulation. When she was finished, she folded the letter neatly along its creases, slid it back into the envelope, and rose from the table. In the study, the small brass key to her desk drawer was waiting in its dish. She unlocked the top drawer, placed the envelope inside, and turned the key until the lock clicked shut. Sophie found her there a few minutes later. "You read it?" she asked, glancing toward the drawer. "I did." "Are you going to answer her?" Evelyn shook her head once. "No." Sophie hesitated. "Even just to tell her no?" "Especially not to tell her no," Evelyn replied. "She wants engagement. I'm not giving her that." Later that day, she carried a copy of the letter, Michael had insisted on making one for his records, to the diner. Helen was in the back, sorting through invoices, the smell of frying onions and coffee permeating the air. When Evelyn handed her the duplicate, Helen scanned it with a dry, disbelieving snort. "This is rich," Helen said, flipping the page over. "She plays the victim, points fingers at ghosts, then asks you for money? That's a new shade of bold." Evelyn said nothing, just watched as Helen reached for the matches kept by the back door. Together they stepped into the narrow alley behind the diner, where the late afternoon sun caught on the damp brick walls. Helen crouched beside an old metal coffee can, crumpled the letter into a tight ball, and struck the match. The flame caught quickly, curling the edges black, the ink bleeding into unreadable shapes before disappearing entirely. Helen stirred the ashes with the burnt matchstick until nothing remained but gray powder. Evelyn watched the smoke rise, her expression unreadable. "Some things," she said finally, "aren't worth even the paper they're printed on." Helen looked up at her. "You know she'll find another way to try." I'm counting on it, Evelyn replied, turning back toward the kitchen door. Inside, the diner's bell jingled as someone came in from the street, the sound bright and unassuming. But Evelyn's mind was already moving past the letter, past the ash cooling in the can, toward the next move in a game that was now entirely hers to control. The papers were already waiting on Michael's desk when Evelyn arrived the next morning, crisp and deliberate in a manila folder. He stood as she entered, gesturing toward the chair opposite him. "They're exactly as we discussed," he said. "Every property, every business interest, every share, folded into a single trust in Sophie's name. Irrevocable. Once it's signed and filed, even you won't be able to undo it." "That's the point," Evelyn replied, setting her bag on the floor and removing her gloves. Sophie sat beside her, legs crossed tightly, her backpack still over one shoulder as if she weren't sure whether she belonged in the room. She kept glancing at the papers, then at Evelyn and back again. Michael slid the folder toward Evelyn. "You'll sign in the marked spaces. I'll notarize, and then we'll walk this straight to the courthouse vault." Evelyn picked up the pen, her fingers steady. She moved through the pages without hesitation, initial here, signature there, her handwriting neat and controlled, the ink settling into the paper like the final strokes of a painting. She didn't speak until the last page was signed, and she set the pen down. "This way," she said, turning to Sophie. "No one can ever take it from you." For a moment, Sophie only stared at her. Then her hands came up to cover her mouth, her eyes bright in the morning light. The word caught. "I don't know what to say?" "You don't have to say anything." Evelyn reached across the table, her fingers resting briefly over Sophie's. "Just remember what it means to keep something safe." Michael stamped each page with the notary seal, the sharp click of the embosser punctuating the quiet. He gathered the documents, squared the stack against the desk, and slipped them into a heavy envelope. "Let's finish it," he said. The courthouse was only a block away, the winter air cool and clean against their faces. Inside, the echo of their footsteps followed them down the marble corridor to the records division. The clerk on duty, a man with silver hair and a bow tie slightly askew, greeted Evelyn with the warmth reserved for someone who had weathered many storms and still stood. Michael handed over the envelope. "Estate transfer documents. Irrevocable trust. Beneficiary Sophie Harper." The clerk nodded and unlocked a side door, leading them into the narrow room where the vault door stood open, its steel face pocked and worn from decades of use. Shelves lined the walls, each labeled with dates and case numbers. Evelyn watched as the envelope was placed into a locked drawer, the key turned, and the location logged into the thick leather-bound register. When the clerk closed the vault door, the sound was deep and final, like the turning of a tide. "That's it," Michael said as they stepped back into the sunlight. "It's done. Permanent." They didn't go home right away. Helen had insisted they stop by the diner, and when they arrived, she was already behind the counter with 3 mugs waiting and a bottle of champagne on ice in the back. "You don't toast with coffee," she said, disappearing for a moment and returning with 3 mismatched flutes. The champagne was cheap, but the cork still popped against the ceiling tile, making Sophie jump and laugh through the last of her tears. Helen poured and raised her glass. "To keeping what's yours and making sure no one can touch it." They clinked glasses, the sound small but solid, and for the first time in weeks, Evelyn allowed herself to feel the shape of victory. Not the noisy kind, the quiet, enduring kind that could last longer than a lifetime. It was full dark when she left the diner alone, her coat buttoned high against the harbor wind. The street lamps cast soft pools of light along the sidewalk, and the harbor stretched out beyond them, black and silver under the moon. She walked slowly, letting the rhythm of the water against the pilings mark her steps. At the edge of her street, she paused, looking back toward the glow of the diner's windows and the faint silhouette of the marina beyond. Sophie's name was now written into the records in a way no court could undo, no rival could reach. That knowledge sat in her chest like a steady flame. From somewhere down the block, a figure stepped briefly into the light, too far to make out, but watching. Evelyn didn't stop walking. She only adjusted her gloves, lifted her chin, and let the harbor lights guide her the rest of the way home. The sun was just beginning its descent when the first guests arrived at the East Marina. The harbor reflected the pale gold of the evening sky, rippling with the slow movement of fishing boats returning from the day. Long folding tables, covered in mismatched tablecloths, had been set up along the pier. The smell of grilled fish mingled with the scent of salt water carried on the breeze. Evelyn stood near the end of the dock, greeting each arrival with a handshake or a brief embrace. The people who came were the ones who had known her the longest, boat owners who rented slips year-round, families who worked the water for a living, and locals who had weathered more than one coastal storm with her at their side. There were children darting between the tables, their laughter skipping across the surface of the water. Sophie moved easily among the crowd, a stack of paper plates in one arm, refilling serving stations and carrying platters from the grill to the tables. Her cheeks were flushed from the effort, her hair tied back in a loose ponytail that kept slipping over her shoulder. Evelyn caught her eye once across the tables, and Sophie gave a quick smile before returning to the work of keeping food moving. Helen, in her element, floated from group to group with the natural ease of someone who had spent decades running a diner. She topped off cups, swapped jokes, and steered shy newcomers toward familiar faces. When she laughed, it carried over the hum of conversation, like a warm tide. By the time the last tray of food was set down, the tables were full. The light over the water had deepened into amber, the air cooling just enough to raise the scent of the tide from the rocks below. Evelyn stood, lifting her glass for quiet. "I'm glad you're all here," she began, her voice carrying over the gentle lapping of the harbor. "This marina has been more than just a place to dock boats. It's been a place where people come together, neighbors, friends, sometimes even strangers who needed a safe harbor. I've been thinking about what comes next and how to make sure this place keeps giving something back." She paused, scanning the faces around the table, the weathered hands of the fishermen, the eager eyes of the younger ones leaning forward to listen. "That's why I'm starting a youth mentorship program," she continued. "Funded directly by the trust, it'll give young people here a chance to learn the trade, whether it's repairing engines, navigating the water, or running a business on shore. No one should have to leave this town to build a future if they don't want to." There was a beat of stillness before the applause began, first in small bursts, then growing until it filled the pier. Laughter followed, along with the clink of glasses and the scrape of chairs as people stood to shake her hand or clap her on the shoulder. Michael rose from his seat at the far end of the table, lifting his own glass. "To quiet victories," he said, his gaze finding Evelyn's across the table. "The kind that last." "To quiet victories," the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. The rest of the evening settled into the easy rhythm of shared food and old stories. Lanterns strung between the posts swayed gently in the breeze, their light casting soft halos over the weathered wood. Evelyn found herself sitting beside Helen, who was pretending not to watch Sophie laughing with a group of teenagers near the edge of the dock. "She's going to do fine," Helen murmured, not quite hiding the note of pride in her voice. "I know," Evelyn said, and she meant it. Later, as the tables began to empty and the last of the dishes were cleared away, Evelyn lingered at the end of the pier. The harbor was quiet now, save for the occasional creak of rope against wood. She let her eyes adjust to the darkness, following the line of the dock until it disappeared into shadow. Farther down the pier, where the lantern light didn't quite reach, a shape shifted, there and gone in the space of a blink. Evelyn didn't move toward it. She simply rested her hand on the railing, feeling the cool grain of the wood beneath her fingers, and waited for the night to settle around her. The first light of day slid across the harbor like a slow tide, turning the water from slate to silver. Evelyn walked the docks with Sophie at her side, their footsteps muffled by the damp planks. The air was cool and clean, carrying the faint metallic scent of the sea just before the morning fleet headed out. A gull's cry broke the stillness, circling once overhead before disappearing toward the open water. Sophie had her hands buried in the pockets of her jacket, shoulders slightly hunched against the breeze. She'd been quiet since they'd left the house, her gaze flicking between the boats moored along the pier. Halfway down the dock, she stopped. "I was going to wait until later," she said, reaching into her jacket. "But this feels like the right place." She handed Evelyn a single envelope, the paper warm from her pocket. Evelyn recognized the college crest in the corner before she even opened it. She slid a finger under the flap and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear Miss Harper, we are pleased to inform you." The rest of the words blurred for a moment. Evelyn didn't need to read them twice. She looked up, meeting Sophie's wide, expectant eyes, and let a slow smile spread across her face. "They'd have been fools not to take you." Sophie laughed, half relief, half disbelief, and wrapped her arms around her grandmother. Evelyn returned the hug, breathing in the scent of salt and wind tangled in her hair. When they parted, Evelyn reached into the bag slung over her shoulder and pulled out 2 paper cups from Helen's diner, still hot enough to steam in the cool air. They sat on the bench Daniel had insisted on all those years ago, the wood worn smooth from sun and salt. Out on the water, the first boats of the day eased away from their slips. Diesel engines rumbled low, sending small wakes lapping against the dock. The sky above them warmed from pale gold to soft blue, streaked with thin clouds drifting toward the horizon. Evelyn took a sip of coffee, the heat settling into her chest. She thought of Daniel. His laugh when Sophie caught her first fish, the way his hands could splice a rope or steady a rudder with equal care. For the first time in years, the thought didn't carry the sting of loss. It rested in her mind like a photograph she could hold without flinching. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Sophie asked quietly. "I know he would," Evelyn said. "Of both of us." Across the street, the neon sign above Helen's diner flickered to life in the early light. The front door swung open, and Helen stepped outside, her apron already on, waving a towel in greeting. Evelyn lifted her coffee in return, and Helen grinned before disappearing back inside. The phone in Evelyn's coat pocket buzzed. She answered without checking the screen. "It's done," Michael's voice said. "The trust is officially recorded in the county register. It's permanent now. No challenges, no loopholes. It's exactly as we intended." Evelyn felt the words settle like a final knot drawn tight. "Thank you, Michael." "Enjoy your morning," he replied, and hung up. She slipped the phone away, letting her gaze drift back over the harbor. The tide was rising, filling the spaces between pilings, lifting each boat gently in its berth. Sophie leaned back against the bench, the acceptance letter folded in her lap, the future bright in her eyes. The town was waking, muffled clatter from the diner's kitchen, the creak of shop doors opening, the distant hum of a truck on the main road. Evelyn watched it all, the rhythm of a place she had fought for, reshaped, and now left in hands she trusted more than her own. She finished her coffee and set the empty cup beside her. The breeze shifted, carrying the smell of fresh bread from the bakery down the street, mingled with the ever-present tang of the sea. For years, other people had tried to decide what she could keep, what she could lose, and who she should be without. They had written their versions of her story in whispers, in courtrooms, in headlines. Evelyn stood, the boards of the dock firm under her feet, the water stretching out ahead in endless, shifting light. "They tried to write me out," she said, more to herself than to Sophie, her voice low but certain. "I signed the ending myself.